The destruction of New Horizon did not begin with fire or invasion. It began with a sound, a low, tremoring hum that passed through the colony's outer comm grid one silent dawn, a resonance so deep it made the metal bones of the habitat rings quiver. The colonists thought it was a malfunction, or perhaps a seismic ripple from the planet's shifting crust. They had no idea that the hum was the first symptom of something buried beneath their feet, deeper than any scan had ever reached, older than any human record still preserved. But they would never learn the truth, because only minutes later, space tore open above the colony, and the Tarvek emerged. They came in jagged formations, black-edged ships slicing through the pale sky like shards of a broken mirror. The colony's orbital defense platforms tried to ignite, but they barely had time to rotate before Tarvek cannons ripped them apart. The sky glowed red from molten fragments spiraling downward like burning snow. Civilians ran for bunkers and pressure shelters, alarms screeching through every corridor and dome. Habitation farms sealed their bulkheads. School modules collapsed their walls into emergency shielding. Medical wings overflowed with people crushed by debris or caught in atmospheric ruptures. The Tarvek didn't land troops. They didn't need to. They preferred sterilization from orbit, swift, clean, total. They bombarded the colony with pulses of white fire that vaporized entire structures. Shield domes shattered, scattering crystalline shards across the plains. The colony's main communication spire survived exactly 6 seconds before a lance of plasma skewered it, turning it into a spiral of collapsing metal. Colonial Command transmitted its final, fragmented message to Earth in a desperate burst of compressed data. Most of the packet disintegrated mid-transmission, dissolved by interference from the bombardment. But a few seconds survived, and those seconds were burned into the logs of every human relay in the sector. Static, screaming, the crash of collapsing bulkheads, then a panicked voice. "They're breaching the core vault." After that, only a wet hiss. Then silence. The Tarvek celebrated. To them, New Horizon was simply another resource node eliminated, one less speck of human expansion cluttering the outer sectors. They marked it as extracted and burned, and prepared to strip whatever was left of value. But none of them questioned the words core vault. None understood the significance of the old hum that had tremored through the colony. None knew that New Horizon had not been chosen by accident. Humanity had seeded worlds like this one during ages of fear, epochs when extinction seemed inevitable. And on a select few worlds, buried so deeply no conqueror would notice, humanity had hidden its last contingency. When the bombardment cracked open the crust beneath Sector Delta of the colony, something ancient felt the rupture, something dormant, something that was never meant to be awakened casually. Deep underground, the core vault was not a chamber, but a chrysalis, an impossibly vast cocoon woven from alloys that pulsed with trapped potential. The darkness inside the vault stirred. Folds shifted. Forms stretched like sleepers waking after millennia. The builders had not been created for war. War was only an interpretation of their purpose, an inevitable expression of their mandate. They had been crafted long before humanity's golden age, in the era when Earth's sky was still filled with ash from the last collapse, when humanity was fragile and hunted and clinging to survival. The builders were designed to ensure that humanity would never again face extinction alone. And now, after centuries in silence, the builders awakened to the smell of burning soil and the absence of human life. They unfolded from their cocoons in towering silhouettes, geometric giants that defied clear biology or machinery. Not alive, not dead. Something in between, something engineered to outlast civilizations. Their surfaces shimmered like oil-slick metal, reflecting the glow of magma leaking from the cracked crust. Their eyes, if they could be called eyes, were fractal pools of shifting light, absorbing every photon, every vibration, every trace of the massacre above. The colony was gone. Human biosigns? Zero. Threat analysis completed. Conclusion: catastrophic aggression against protected lineage. Directive 2. Initiate retaliation. The builders rose in seamless unity, each massive form moving with the same precise grace, as though they shared one thought. Their presence made the ground vibrate. Air rippled around them in geometric pulses. And as they marched toward the surface, the hum that had announced their awakening grew louder, rising from a trembling whisper to a deep cosmic warning. The Tarvek believed they had conquered a defenseless world. They had not conquered anything. They had awakened something that remembered every human scream ever recorded, every extinction event humanity barely survived, every loss that had shaped their creator's resolve. New Horizon was dead. But the Builders had just been born again. The Builders' awakening did not resemble the conventional understanding of combat or intelligence. They were not machines, nor sentient in any traditional sense, nor even alive in the biological way that humans or Tarvek understood. They were instruments of preservation and judgment, forged by a long-extinct generation of humans during Earth's darkest centuries, when annihilation seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Their creators had anticipated the fragility of human civilization and built safeguards that could survive millennia, vaults buried under distant colonies, systems that could observe, calculate, and intervene if humanity was threatened beyond recovery. New Horizons' core vault was one of these safeguards, and when the Tarvik strike broke its seals, it triggered protocols that had remained dormant for centuries, protocols that now transformed the planet into a crucible of unimaginable power. The Builders unfolded across the planet with eerie, perfect synchronicity. Their forms were towering, geometric, and incomprehensible, like colossal crystalline origami, endlessly folding and reforming in ways that defied Euclidean logic. Some were cylindrical, others fractal towers spiraling into the stratosphere. Magnetic lattices hummed around them, drawing energy from the planet's core, while nanoconstructs emerged from fissures, repairing, building, and reinforcing with lightning speed. These constructs moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, consuming the debris left by the Tarvek assault and rearranging it into structures of intricate design. Bridges of unknown alloys formed between planetary spires. Enormous lenses aligned themselves to capture the energy of the distant star. And fields of oscillating gravitic flux rose above the surface, rippling in patterns that bent light, time, and perception itself. The colony's ruins transformed into a vast, organized lattice of power, alive with quiet intent. Above the planet, the Tarvek fleet returned, expecting to scavenge, to gloat over the remains of a defenseless human colony. But nothing awaited them in orbit but structures they could neither categorize nor attack. When one of the Tarvek warships fired upon a builder spire, the beam passed through an optical interference field and vanished, absorbed, redirected, refracted, until it struck the firing ship itself in a precise line that tore through hull, core, and crew with the cold efficiency of mathematics. The attack had no explosion, no fire, no smoke. It simply erased the vessel as if it had never existed. Sensors across the fleet failed, communications sputtered, and panic spread like a contagion. Every Tarvek officer felt an instinctive dread, though they did not understand why. The builders were not screaming, threatening, or negotiating. They simply existed, and that existence carried consequences far beyond comprehension. From New Horizons' surface, the builders extended further. Nanoconstruct swarms ascended like living swarms of metallic jellyfish, fusing into larger forms with crystalline cores that pulsed with energy. The planetary surface trembled, splitting to feed rising vessels and orbital spires. Magnetic flux corridors projected into space, forming invisible corridors that bent gravity and warped space, making the planet seem larger than it was, a fortress of impossible dimensions. The Tarvek fleet struggled to hold formation, compasses spinning, inertial systems warping, and quantum sensors feeding false readings. Space itself had become fluid, bending around the builders' designs. Calculations of flight paths, weapon trajectories, and escape vectors that had been perfected over generations proved useless against structures that did not obey conventional physics. And all the while, the builders moved with calm precision, responding only to stimuli that mattered, the aggression against humanity. Back on Earth, alerts flooded the command networks. Humanity had prepared for alien attacks, insurgencies, and rogue AI incidents, but the builders were something else entirely. Generals and scientists stared at incomprehensible readings, at energy readings surpassing planetary reactors, at movements that contradicted every law of physics they had ever known. They realized, almost simultaneously, that the builders were not under their command, but they worked for humanity. They existed because humanity had endured, had survived, had been threatened, and had been nearly wiped out. The builders' calculus was clear. Any species that harmed humans to the point of annihilation would meet consequences far beyond conventional war. The Tarvek home sector soon became the target. The builders did not send fleets to negotiate. They did not hail warnings or demand surrender. They moved like vectors of inevitability, folding space and time to intersect the Tarvek armadas. Enemy ships folded in on themselves, becoming precise geometric solids, or were drawn into gravitational nulls that dissolved hulls at the molecular level. Capital ships disassembled silently, leaving no wreckage. Entire stations vanished as though the Tarvek Empire had been erased by a mathematical equation. The few surviving vessels fled, only to be guided back into the builders' paths, not by pursuit, but by the inexorable pull of the system's calculated inevitability. The builders did not speak of vengeance, they did not rage. They acted with pure, objective precision, removing threats and preserving what remained of human lineage. Above all, the builders demonstrated that they were not simply defensive mechanisms. They were adaptive, learning, evolving, and expanding their capabilities in real time. Nanoforges could consume an entire warship, replicate it into smaller tactical drones, and redeploy them within minutes. Orbital spires rearranged themselves in response to enemy vectors, forming labyrinthine corridors that trapped fleets in virtual mazes. The builders' understanding of combat was not tactical. It was absolute, transcending strategy, instinct, or biology. They were the inevitable consequence of any species that dared harm humanity without restraint. And humanity, watching from afar, realized for the first time the scale of what they had created, not consciously, but out of necessity. The builders were not a tool, not a weapon, not a fleet. They were judgment. They were survival. They were the manifestation of every human instinct to endure, to defend, to rise from ashes and annihilation alike. When New Horizons' ruins finally fell silent, the Tarvek Empire had learned a truth they could never unlearn. The humans they had thought weak, expendable, and defenseless had left behind guardians capable of rewriting the rules of the cosmos. And in that silence, across millions of kilometers of transformed battlefield, the builders waited for humanity's signal, uncontrolled, uncommanded, and yet utterly faithful to their creators. The galaxy had not yet seen the builders' full power, but the first echo of their awakening had already begun to reshape the balance of all things. The first Tarvek fleets to approach New Horizon after the awakening did not recognize the world they had once tried to conquer. The planet was no longer a fragile colony of humans. They had encountered a living monument, a planet reshaped by intelligence that did not bleed, did not fear, did not negotiate. Orbital sensors registered impossible geometries, vast crystalline lattices rising from the surface, energy arcs crisscrossing the atmosphere, and spires so large that even the tallest dreadnoughts seemed puny in comparison. Magnetic distortions rippled across space, bending sensor readings and scrambling navigation systems. The Tarvik admiral who first glimpsed it thought he had been thrown into an optical hallucination, but the reality was far worse. This was real, and it was alive with intent. The builders did not emerge to confront the Tarvek in the way fleets traditionally did. There was no formation, no fleet engagement, no initial salvo. Instead, they unfolded like a precise, patient storm. On the surface, towering spires and orbital rings constructed themselves with a silent elegance. Nano-construct swarms surged through the wreckage of New Horizon, gathering debris, recycling materials, fusing structures into impossible patterns. The planetary surface became a lattice of energy and metal, a living city that obeyed commands no human could understand. Orbital towers projected gravitic corridors that twisted space, creating invisible walls and traps that could manipulate entire fleets before a single weapon was fired. The Tarvek, arrogant and confident, underestimated the builders' precision. The first scout vessel fired on one of the builder spires, a sleek, silver and black column rising hundreds of kilometers above the ground, humming with energy far beyond the comprehension of conventional technology. The beam did not penetrate. It vanished, refracted into a perfectly straight path that intersected the firing vessel itself. The Scout was cleaved in half, its molecules rearranged and scattered across a quantum pattern so precise that nothing recognizable remained. Panic spread through the fleet like wildfire. The builders did not celebrate or gloat. They did not advance or withdraw. They merely responded with calculation, assessing threats and neutralizing them with deterministic certainty. Within minutes, the Tarvek home fleet realized that their weapons were no longer weapons. The energy pulses they relied upon for orbital strikes were absorbed and redirected with surgical precision. Capital ships folded upon themselves. Weapon batteries detonated internally, and navigation systems failed catastrophically. Entire fleets were neutralized without a single builder leaving the surface. The builders had no names, no flags, no ranks. They existed solely as executioners of their directives. And their directive was clear: preserve humanity, punish the perpetrators, and do so with absolute efficiency. Then came the nanoforges. Tens of millions of microscopic drones emerged from the planetary crust, moving in swarm formations that were both horrifying and beautiful. They consumed the remnants of Tarvik warships with voracious efficiency, reshaping metal and energy into new constructs in real time. Ships, weapons, and satellites were repurposed into weapons of unimaginable design. They moved like a single organism, operating in perfect harmony with the builders' greater systems. What humans on distant fleets could barely perceive as a movement was actually a reorganization of the planet's entire material composition. Mountains shifted, rivers flowed through magnetic conduits, and spires extended into orbit to form colossal lattice frameworks. The builders' actions were simultaneously defensive, offensive, and artistic, a terrifying synthesis that no alien mind could comprehend. As the Tarvek fleets attempted tactical retreats, they discovered that the builders had already anticipated their movements. Slipspace corridors, once reliable for rapid jumps, were distorted by the builders' gravitic corridors, folding space to funnel enemy ships into neutralization zones. The Tarvek scrabbled to adapt, but adaptation required time, a luxury the builders did not permit. Each assault vector, each maneuver, each attempt at evasion was countered with absolute precision. Ships evaporated silently. Entire battle groups were reorganized into geometric patterns in orbit, and command structures were disassembled without warning or mercy. Human observers, monitoring the events from distant colonies and Earth, struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The builders operated beyond the parameters of human strategy, instinct, and logic. They were an expression of humanity's survival instinct made manifest on a planetary scale. They had no pride, no emotion, and yet the weight of their presence carried a message so profound that every species capable of observation instinctively understood it: do not threaten humanity. To harm them was to invite annihilation of a kind so total it could only be executed by a mind unconstrained by flesh, fear, or convention. By the time the Tarvek leadership understood the magnitude of their mistake, it was already too late. Their fleets had been sliced into incomprehensible forms, orbital stations compressed into geometrical ruins, and entire colonies left as nothing more than proof that the builders' will was absolute. They did not offer warnings. They did not demand surrender. They simply executed, calculated, and waited. It was not vengeance in the human sense. It was inevitability. The builders were impartial, inexorable, and utterly devoted to the preservation of humanity. And as the last Tarvek vessel drifted powerless across the warped space around New Horizon, the first human fleet arrived, shocked, awestruck, and finally realizing that the war they thought they were entering had already been fought. The battlefield was quiet now, but it had been rewritten entirely. The builders had redefined the rules of conflict, and no conventional strategy could counter them. In that moment, every human officer, soldier, and civilian watching from orbit realized the terrifying truth. The Tarvek had not destroyed humanity, they had only awakened its guardians. And those guardians had already rewritten the fate of the galaxy. The galaxy trembled in ways that no council, no armada, and no scholar could have predicted. Word spread faster than light. New Horizon had not been merely defended, it had been transformed into a living fortress, a planetary-scale weapon of unfathomable precision. The builders, humanity's hidden champions, had ascended from the ashes, and they were not content to remain isolated. They did not communicate, negotiate, or parade their might. They simply acted, and their actions rewrote the cosmic balance. Across the Tarvek Empire, panic gripped every strategic command. Worlds that had been considered safe were suddenly vulnerable. Entire fleets that had once projected dominance found themselves disappearing without warning, disassembled by forces that defied all known physics. Reports were fragmented, incomprehensible, and terrifying. Starports vanishing in flashes of geometric light, orbital fortresses reconstituted into alien lattices that manipulated gravity and time, battleships disassembled into atoms and then reformed into nanoscopic swarms that attacked the enemy with unerring accuracy. Sensor arrays overloaded, trying to track the builders' movement. Navigation systems failed catastrophically in sectors where the builders had passed. leaving fleets stranded in warp corridors that no longer obeyed conventional calculations. The galaxy's leaders, from the oldest councils to the youngest star empires, watched with growing alarm. The Tarvek had been considered one of the most formidable powers of the Outer Arms. Their fleets feared even among the warlike civilizations of the central sectors. Yet even their bravest admirals could not anticipate the Builders' methods. Conventional weapons were irrelevant. Fleet tactics were obsolete. Diplomacy was meaningless. The Builders moved according to their own logic, a logic that accounted for every permutation of action and reaction faster than any sentient mind could conceive. Yet, despite the overwhelming destruction of enemy fleets, the Builders never acted indiscriminately. They did not pursue annihilation for its own sake. Planets with surviving human life were left intact, reorganized into geometries that suggested protection, fortification, and preservation. Systems devoid of human presence were subjected to systematic neutralization if they had been instruments of aggression. Entire civilizations that had allied with the Tarvek were spared or contained based on whether their actions threatened humanity. Every intervention was deliberate, precise, and final, a demonstration not of cruelty, but of the Builders' directive to safeguard their creators and punish the violators. For human fleets watching from the edges of the conflict zones, the scale of the Builders' power was almost incomprehensible. Entire enemy task forces, numbering in the hundreds of ships, were systematically neutralized without a single human crew taking action. Tarvek dreadnoughts and frigates were repurposed, broken down into micro-drones and energy matrices, and redeployed in ways that humans could barely track. Massive orbital platforms, once considered impregnable, were reduced to lattice fragments in moments. In every encounter, the Builders' movements suggested a prescient understanding of war, as if they had anticipated every maneuver centuries before the enemy even conceived it. The Tarvek leadership tried desperately to regroup, relying on conventional methods that had always brought victory: overwhelming firepower, strict coordination, and brutal intimidation. Yet every plan failed before it began. Their communications, encrypted and routed through subspace channels, were intercepted, distorted, or nullified by fields that bent space and time. Fleets attempting retreat found themselves subtly guided back into neutralization corridors created by the Builders. Calculated gravitational eddies and phased energy matrices made even warp travel a potential death sentence. The galaxy was being reshaped, not by conquest, but by inevitability. Meanwhile, rumors spread through human networks faster than the Builders' visible actions. Colonists whispered of the planet's surface rising and folding in impossible geometries, of structures that seemed to think and act, of a silent army that could crush fleets before they even knew what hit them. Pilots reported phenomena that defied physics: ships vanishing into corridors of folded space, enemy lasers redirected back toward their own vessels, massive constructs forming and dissolving like thought forms made real. The Builder phenomenon began to transcend fear and entered into legend even before humans could fully comprehend it. As the Tarvek Empire's borders collapsed under the Builders' invisible hand, the Builders themselves did not communicate with humanity in the traditional sense. They did not hail the surviving fleets, nor did they issue commands. Their directive was singular: protect humanity, punish aggressors. Yet even without explicit guidance, human commanders recognized the Builders' intentions. They acted not as allies, but as extensions of humanity's will, guardians that required no orders to enforce the survival of their creators. By the time the surviving Tarvek fleets retreated to their homeworlds, entire star systems had been neutralized, political structures destabilized, and the Empire itself was fractured. Worlds that had been centers of power were left as crystalline ruins, orbiting monuments to the builder's precision. The galaxy was silent except for the hum of the builder's operations, a resonance that suggested both warning and promise. For the first time in millennia, it became clear to every species that had ever considered threatening humanity, there was a force that would not be negotiated with, bargained with, or defeated. There was a force that existed solely to ensure that humanity endured, regardless of the cost to anyone who had sought its destruction. And in the quiet that followed, even the most warlike empires realized the terrifying truth. Humanity itself had not fought this battle. Humanity had hidden the power to do so, and that power had been unleashed in a way that made all previous conflicts look insignificant. The builders did not seek vengeance. They sought enforcement of a singular law. Those who harmed humanity without cause would meet a consequence beyond comprehension. The galaxy, for the first time, understood that the humans they had underestimated had left behind guardians whose very existence redefined war, power, and survival. As the builders continued their quiet, inexorable reshaping of the Tarvek Empire's holdings, humanity finally arrived to witness the aftermath of their own ingenuity. Fleets that had once been primed for battle hovered above the transformed New Horizon, stunned at what they saw. The planet was no longer simply a colony. It had become a nexus of impossible geometry, a living lattice of metal, energy, and nanoconstructs operating with singular purpose. Mountains had shifted. Rivers now flowed through channels that generated controlled gravitic currents, and spires that reached hundreds of kilometers into the sky pulsed with energy that could reshape matter itself. To human eyes, it was breathtaking. To alien eyes, it was terrifying beyond reason. The surviving Tarvek fleets that limped back to their home sectors carried only fragments of the horrors they had witnessed. Entire fleets had vanished, colonies had been neutralized, and command structures had been reduced to silence. Communications that had once functioned flawlessly now emitted only interference and dissonant echoes of quantum distortions. The builders had rewritten the fabric of reality within their reach. The galaxy had been shown that humanity's reach was not measured in ships or weapons, but in foresight and enduring resilience. Humanity itself had remained absent from the front lines, yet, by merely existing, it had ensured its survival, and the builders had executed the enforcement of its preservation with absolute, terrifying precision. On the edge of the sector, human commanders cautiously approached the transformed world. They did not attempt to communicate directly with the builders. Their sensors registered activity, but no signals, no instructions, no acknowledgement. It was as if the builders were both everywhere and nowhere, acting in perfect alignment with humanity's interests without ever requiring orders. Scientists speculated feverishly on the nature of these constructs. Were they artificial intelligence? Were they some form of post-human technology? Were they conscious at all? The answers eluded them. What was clear, however, was that the builders' presence had fundamentally altered the galaxy's balance of power. Across the Tarvek Empire, chaos reigned. Formerly dominant sectors no longer responded to central commands. Entire populations had been neutralized, not with cruelty, but with the impartiality of mathematical precision. Rebel fleets and dissident worlds realized too late that resistance was pointless. Every threat to humanity had already been accounted for. The Tarvek leadership itself fractured, unable to reconcile the sudden, overwhelming losses with their prior understanding of warfare. The builders' intervention was not strategic in the conventional sense. It was absolute, complete, and final. The galaxy had been reminded, in no uncertain terms, that humanity was not alone in its survival. As humanity observed, the builders began to reconfigure parts of New Horizon in ways that hinted at preparation rather than aggression. Energy conduits, spires, and orbital lattices were aligned in configurations that suggested storage, monitoring, and rapid deployment. Nanoconstructs moved with relentless efficiency, repairing, reinforcing, and expanding structures as though anticipating future threats. Humanity realized, with a mixture of awe and unease, that the builders were not only guardians, they were extensions of human intent, capable of operating independently, yet perfectly in line with humanity's survival instincts. They were living legacies, waiting silently for the moment when their creators would truly need them. Meanwhile, other species across the galaxy began to take notice. Fleets that had once considered human expansion insignificant now reconsidered every strategy. Trade routes, colonies, and outposts were scrutinized with extreme caution. Ancient empires that had dismissed humanity as weak, primitive, or inconsequential learned a new lesson. Humans were never truly alone, and those who underestimated them could disappear without trace. Whispers traveled through the void of space. Stories of worlds that vanished, fleets that were erased, and civilizations that fell not because humanity fought directly, but because humanity had prepared, hidden, and endured. On New Horizon itself, the builders began to establish patterns that hinted at future interaction. Platforms emerged, capable of launching rapid response units. Massive constructs took positions that could cover entire star systems. Their movements were silent, deliberate, and incomprehensible. Yet their purpose was unmistakable: readiness for any threat to humanity anywhere. The humans watching realized that the galaxy's balance of power had shifted irrevocably. It was no longer a question of who could conquer whom. It was now a question of who could survive the silent, precise judgment of the builders. Finally, humanity took a moment to reflect. The builders had not acted out of malice, pride, or vengeance. They had acted according to a directive older than most human civilizations. Their creators had foreseen extinction, betrayal, and aggression, and they had prepared. New Horizon had been lost, the Tarvek had been punished, and the galaxy had been reminded of humanity's presence and its enduring influence. The builders were a living testament to foresight, resilience, and survival. Humanity had never fought directly, yet the galaxy had been reshaped as if it had. In the silent aftermath, even the oldest star empires understood a new law. To harm humanity was to invite forces that could operate beyond comprehension, beyond physics, beyond strategy. The builders waited, silent and eternal, aligned perfectly with the interests of their creators. Humanity did not need to intervene. Their absence itself had been sufficient. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of space, a new legend began to take shape. A legend that would spread across the stars. Those who threatened humanity were not merely enemies. They were presences marked by inevitability, destined to vanish before the silent guardians that humanity had left behind. The galaxy had witnessed its first encounter with the builders. For humanity, it was a moment of reflection, of awe, and of silent pride. New Horizon was gone, but its death had awakened something eternal. The Tarvek Empire lay in ruins, and every star system that dared approach humanity in aggression would soon understand the same truth. Humanity had survived, not because it fought, not because it wielded fleets, but because it had planned, hidden, and endured beyond reckoning. And the builders, silent, immortal, and precise, would ensure that humanity's survival was never questioned again. The universe had learned a profound lesson. In the end, humanity's reach was measured not by might, but by foresight, preparation, and the guardians it left behind. The galaxy would never forget New Horizon, nor the builders who acted in humanity's name. And in that memory, humanity's silent triumph resonated across the stars, shaping the course of every civilization that dared to look toward Earth and consider conquest.